So, Chad, what can we learn from history about our recession that we're in right now?
Well, I've done a good bit of work on that the last few months, and it turns out that this recession, I think as most folks know, is one of the deepest recessions we've had. It's probably now the deepest since the 1930s. But the interesting thing is that it's not the deepest one in several parts of the country. And I think as we all recognize, not all parts of the country fell into this recession at the same time. Some came in much earlier than the nation in 2007. Some, particularly in this part of the country, really didn't enter recession until late 2008, early 2009. So I wanted to look back and see if that was usually the case. And indeed it is. Historically, different parts of the country, usually depending on their industrial structure, enter recessions at different times. But interestingly, especially from deep recessions, most parts of the country rebound at about the same time. And looking at why that might be, and going into the recession, the districts of the country, the Federal Reserve districts that tend to enter early, are those that are heavy in manufacturing. That's what tends to enter first, the upper Midwest in particular. And indeed, that's what largely happened this time. And then the districts that are heavily concentrated in energy, such as the Dallas district, or much of the Kansas City district, which we're in Oklahoma, tend to enter later. Energy prices tend to rise, leading to a recession. And then as the recession begins, stay high for a while, and it's only when they begin to fall that those parts of the country concentrated on energy start to go into the recession. But then coming out, it's not so much an industrial structure story as it is the stimulus that's provided from monetary policy and fiscal policy. Most parts of the country get about the same amount of stimulus. Everyone gets lower interest rates. Fiscal stimulus plans tend to be spread fairly broadly, and so places tend to come out of recession at about the same time.
Now, I've seen the date of mid-2010 is when we possibly could see a little bit of recovery. Is that something that you found out in your work?
Well, looking at the most recent data, I think most folks actually expect the recession to technically be over about right now, in about the third quarter of 2009. GDP is expected to be positive, and that's what a lot of folks will look at in terms of when the recession is officially over. But employment tends to lag recessions and come out early, and I think especially in this case, since the recovery is generally expected to be fairly mild, employment may not begin rising until 2010.
So a jobless recovery is really nothing new.
It's not particularly new. The two most recent recessions in 2001 and in 1990, we did experience a bit of a jobless recovery after GDP began to rise, and that seems to be perhaps where we're headed this time as well.
So a rising GDP, but maybe still some weakness in jobs. What about exports?
Exports have been rising the last couple of months. World trade really collapsed in the latter part of last year, first part of this year. The biggest collapse since the Great Depression, both imports and exports. But they have begun to rise in just the last month or two. And I think a lot of folks believe that if growth in the economy is going to pick up, one of the leading factors is going to be exports. We've relied so much on the consumer in terms of both consumer spending and housing the rest of this decade. Those things are still largely over-leveraged, and it'll take a time for folks to work their way out of that. And so it'll be the external sector, the export sector, that could drive growth heading forward.
Yeah. Are there any wild cards out there that could maybe disrupt this, what sounds like a business cycle almost?
There are. The one thing, like I mentioned, that's going to make this recovery perhaps a bit different is that consumers are still pressed. Consumer spending probably became a bit too much a part of the economy earlier this decade, and it needs to shrink relative to the size of business and exports. And so that will likely put a damper on growth for a while. Now, some sectors of the economy are still struggling to some degree. We're beginning to see perhaps a bottom in housing, but the commercial real estate sector is still a danger as employment has fallen nationally by so much over the past year. Those workers have vacated office space. They've stopped spending so much at retail stores. And so in many parts of the country, commercial real estate is overbuilt. And as that becomes more of a problem, that could be more of a drag on the economy over the next year or so.
Yeah, are there certain areas of the economy where we've seen some job loss, where we may not see those jobs coming back?
There are some kinds of manufacturing, perhaps, that the scale of layoffs has been so large. And when the layoffs are made, I think the expectations are that the job losses are permanent. Relative to some previous deeper recessions, such as in the early 80s, there were significant manufacturing job losses then, but it was generally with the understanding of when the economy turned around, a lot of those jobs would come back. The data suggests that that's a bit less of the case now. Although the job losses have been so much and so fast, and since part of our future growth is going to need to rely on exports, there will be a rebound in manufacturing employment in some areas.
Okay. How has our farm economy, how has it fared throughout this?
It's really held on fairly well. You know, it really continued to boom through 2007 and much of 2008 with the commodity prices similar to oil and gas. And you know, those prices have since come down, but they haven't come down as much, and they're still relatively high by historic standards. Corn prices have come down a bit recently, but farm incomes in our region are still holding up fairly well.
So understanding all this, how does Oklahoma compare with the rest of the nation?
Well, as usual, we entered this recession quite a bit later than the nation. That's been the historic case. In fact, in every recession since World War II, Oklahoma has entered later. But in only one case did we exit later. And that's because, again, of this phenomenon of most regions coming out of recession at about the same time. And indeed, one of the best indicators for when the country is coming out of recession is when unemployment claims peak nationally. And that appears to have happened back in March of this year. And usually within 2 or 3, 4 months of that time is when the recession ends up being called over. So that would be close to now, as we talked about earlier. In Oklahoma, unemployment claims also seem to peak in the March-April time frame at about the same time. So we entered the recession not until late 2008, almost a year after the nation, but it appears that the bottom might have been reached at about the same time as the nation. And that's historically what's happened in Oklahoma. We enter later, come out at about the same time, and so far the indications are that that's how it's going to be this time.
Yeah, and how important is consumer and business confidence? How important is it to fuel a turnaround?
It's very important for confidence to be there, that consumers are going to be able to have jobs and be able to spend. And those numbers are still fairly low nationally. We saw in the markets on Friday a weak consumer confidence number, and markets came down. They're down again today. So we do need to see more confidence on that front. But as we begin to see some better economic numbers, as folks become more confident in the financial industry in the country again, I think those confidence numbers will begin to pick up.
All right. We certainly appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much.